On a crystalline morning high above Germany, March 6, 1944, Major Hans Kogler peered through the frosted canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. At 28,000 feet, the oxygen mask bit into his face with brutal cold as he scanned the brilliant sky. His mixed formation of fighters cut through the thin air toward the approaching bomber stream. Ground control had promised they'd face no escort at this altitude, not this deep inside the Reich. The mathematics of air superiority seemed to guarantee it. Then the voice crackled through his headset, urgent and climbing toward panic. Enemy fighters. 12 o'clock high, single-engine fighters with drop tanks below them. Kogler's chest tightened. American fighters, single-engine ones, over Brandenburg, barely 50 miles from Berlin itself. The very thought felt like a violation of the natural order. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to fly this far into Germany and still limp back to England. The American P-47 Thunderbolt maxed out its reach somewhere over the Rhine. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning might scratch as far as Hanover on a generous fuel day. But Brandenburg, Berlin itself, impossible. Every calculation the Luftwaffe had built their entire defensive strategy around shattered in that moment. Every assumption crumbled. As Kogler watched the glinting shapes grow larger through his windscreen, their distinctive squared wingtips and lean profiles becoming unmistakable, he understood something with terrible clarity. This was not the heavy, stubby Thunderbolt, not the twin-boomed Lightning with its awkward profile. These were North American P-51 Mustangs. They cut through the sky with the casual confidence of predators who carried enough fuel to hunt for hours, who held altitude in reserve, who knew exactly where their next meal waited below. Somewhere beneath them, 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force pressed toward Berlin, not a feint toward the capital before turning toward secondary targets. A direct strike at the heart of the Third Reich itself. And for the first time in the history of aerial combat, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and back again. Kogler commanded 7 twin-engine Messerschmitt Me-110s and 41 single-engine Me-109s. What he and his formation didn't grasp in those final moments before contact was that this encounter would trigger the most catastrophic psychological collapse in military aviation history. Not merely the destruction of aircraft and pilots, though that would come, but the obliteration of the belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of complete annihilation were being scrawled across the Brandenburg sky at 28,000 feet, written in contrails instead of conference room calculations. The shock had actually been building for weeks, though few officers in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the accumulating evidence. Back on January 11th, Major Hermann Graf commanded Jagdgeschwader 11. He'd encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than any of them should have been capable of flying. His report came back to Berlin suggesting these must be refueled at secret bases in Sweden. The Air Ministry dismissed him as combat-fatigued and unreliable. But the sightings kept multiplying. Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each report pushed the known envelope of American fighter range further east. Each was met with official rejection. On February 15th, the Reich Air Ministry issued a directive. Categorical, absolute. Reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Rhine represented misidentification of twin-engine P-38's or friendly aircraft. Pilots making such claims would face medical evaluation, but the truth proved far more disturbing than Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had accomplished what German technical experts had declared physically impossible. They'd extended the P-51B Mustang's combat radius beyond 650 miles using expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. The mathematics seemed to violate fundamental aerodynamic law. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles while maintaining combat performance should have been an engineering impossibility according to German calculations. Hauptmann Hans Kogler commanded 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11. Early in 1944, he'd written in his diary, "We calculated precisely. American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from English bases. No further. That gave us all of central and eastern Germany as our hunting ground. We could strike the bomber streams without interference. Simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. The Americans couldn't change the laws of physics, but they hadn't changed physics. They'd simply bent it further than the German High Command imagined possible. The secret lay not in the aircraft itself, but in two revolutionary innovations German intelligence had either missed or dismissed as propaganda. The Packard-built Merlin engine, the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard 1653 engine inside the P-51B wasn't merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an improved version, manufactured to tolerances exceeding even the original British specifications. Using American mass production techniques perfected in Detroit's automotive plants, Packard had achieved something remarkable, an engine producing 1,490 horsepower at sea level. Crucially, it maintained over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Feldwebel Konrad Bauer served as technical specialist with JG-26. In February 1944, he examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, revealed the German amazement. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone surpasses anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. But most remarkable remains the production quality, every component machined to exquisite precision. Yet they inform us Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If true, this is not a war of pilots, but production lines. The drop tanks represented an even more elegant solution. Constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin, each 108-gallon auxiliary tank weighed merely 35 pounds, less than the ammunition for one Mustang machine gun. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed the laminated craft paper construction method capable of holding fuel for roughly 5 hours before degradation began, more than sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but their approach reflected fundamental philosophical differences. German tanks were metal, reusable, expensive, heavy. They degraded performance so severely that fighters carrying them became vulnerable. American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon drop tanks could fly to Berlin, jettison them in seconds upon entering combat, then fight with full performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group. During a 1944 briefing, he explained the tactical revolution. The Germans expected us to husband fuel, saving enough for combat and return. With drop tanks, we burned fuel like millionaires, cruised to Berlin on external tanks, dropped them, and still held our full internal fuel load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus enough for the flight home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn. To comprehend the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, one must first understand Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force attempted bombing the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort. Tu-91 B-17 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace that day. 60 were shot down, 138 damaged, a loss rate of 20.6%. Over 600 airmen lost. The Luftwaffe demonstrated with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Ira Eker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to suspend deep penetration raids entirely. General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. Years later in his memoir, The First and the Last, he reflected, "After Schweinfurt, we believed daylight precision bombing had failed. Americans would join the British in night bombing, where accuracy became impossible and damage limited. We'd won the theoretical battle, but Galland, brilliant tactician though he was, made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed Americans would accept existing technology limitations rather than developing new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with extraordinary range reached his desk in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of hallucinating. It wasn't until February 20th, 1944, the opening day of Big Week, that Galland grasped the threat's magnitude. Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, including the first large-scale P-51B deployment. Over the next 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters. More critically, 100 experienced pilots fell, 17% of their available veteran fighter force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland's younger brother commanded 3 squadrons of JG-26. After Big Week, he reported, "The Mustangs changed everything. Previously, we positioned ourselves beyond fighter range and attacked bombers methodically. Now we fought through escorts just to reach bombers, then fought through again, escaping. Every mission became survival from takeoff to landing." The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold across northern Europe, perfect flying weather. At RAF Leicester in England, ground crews had worked through the night, preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted. The first P-51 unit providing escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer commanded the 357th. He briefed his pilots at 600 hours. "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B. The entire distance. You'll be over enemy territory 4 hours. Any man who doubts his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances." No one aborted, yet Colonel Spicer himself would abort shortly after takeoff with mechanical problems, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to assume command of this historic mission. At 08:30, 730 heavy bombers lifted off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide relay escort, P-47's for initial penetration, P-38's for the middle phase, P-51 Mustangs for deepest penetration and target escort. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 successfully reached Berlin after mechanical issues and navigation challenges in heavy cloud cover. In Germany, Reich air defense radar stations began picking up the massive formation assembling over the North Sea. Plotters at Doberitz, the primary fighter control center for Berlin's defense, initially assessed this as another feint. Americans had approached Berlin before, but always turned away, hitting targets in western Germany. Oberst Hayo Hermann commanded the 2nd Fighter Division, responsible for Berlin's defense. He studied the radar plot and made a fateful decision. He would hold fighters on the ground until bombers committed to their target. No point wasting fuel if this proved another deception. At 11:30 hours, the lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. Escorting P-47s engaged German fighters rising from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything proceeded according to established pattern. Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment they knew must come. American escorts reaching fuel limits and turning back. At 12:55 hours, as the bomber stream approached Berlin, Major Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what they believed would be unescorted bombers. 7 Messerschmitt Me-110 night fighters pressed into day service. 41 single-engine Me-109s. German controllers had tracked P-47s turning back and assumed bombers now lay vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes led the 357th's 33 Mustangs that had reached Berlin through difficult weather. Later in his combat report, he described the moment. "We broke through cloud layer, seeing B-24 Liberators below and to our left. We spontaneously spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack. Me-110s and Me-109s. They hadn't seen us. We held altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation focused entirely on the bomber stream. Never saw the Mustangs until far too late." Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, calling out, "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low. Drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Johann Müller flew one of the escorting Me-109s with JG-11. He survived and later described it. "We were in perfect position beginning our attack dive on bombers when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up, seeing single-engine fighters with American markings diving from above. Impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was captured aircraft, some deception. But then I saw drop tanks falling, dozens of them. I knew these were real American fighters with range beyond imagination. What followed wasn't battle, but execution. German fighters caught completely surprised and out of position, scattered in chaos. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Me-109 at low level near Wilnsdorf, then led other flights in strafe runs against a German airfield. At his estate at Karenhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was having lunch. The call came through from General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger. American fighters were over Berlin, single-engine fighters. "You're mistaken, Galland," Göring said flatly. "Check your reports again. Here, Reichsmarschall, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment." Göring's rage turned volcanic. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who stood present, the Reichsmarschall threw his wineglass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason, sabotage. The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I'll have every man making such claims court-martialed." Even as Göring raged, evidence proved undeniable. From his own estate, he could see contrails over Berlin. Distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power. His aide would later testify that Göring stood at the window nearly an hour, watching the sky, saying nothing. That evening, Göring issued his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot claiming to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin faced arrest for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters remained the Rhine. Scientific fact. The order created chaos in fighter units already reeling from losses. Pilots who just survived combat against P-51s now faced court-martial threats for reporting what they'd witnessed. Several squadron commanders, including Major Günther Ruhl, simply ignored the order and instructed pilots to report twin-engine fighters in combat reports. General Adolf Galland came to a heated conference at the Air Ministry on March 8. He presented Göring a piece of P-51 drop tank, clearly stamped, "Made in USA," recovered from fields near Magdeburg. Göring's response entered Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter." Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible. According to Galland's memoirs, this was the moment he knew Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Göring would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, Mustang appearance over Berlin represented not mere tactical surprise, but existential crisis. These were men repeatedly told they defended an impregnable fortress. That German science and engineering surpassed anything Allies could produce. Hauptmann Heinz Kogler commanded 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11. On March 7, 1944, he wrote in his diary, "Yesterday changed everything. We always knew where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters but hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological impact amplified with opposition quality. The P-51B wasn't merely present over Berlin, it dominated. Its Merlin engine achieved 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Me-109 G6 managed 386 miles per hour at identical altitude. Its laminar flow wing provided exceptional high-altitude handling. Its 650 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower. Most crucially, its pilots were fresh, unfatigued from hours battling at fuel reserve edges. Unteroffizier Werner Poss flew with JG-301. He survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9 and described the experience. They came from above and behind, always holding altitude advantage. When we turned engaging, they zoomed climbing away. They possessed power for vertical flight whenever desired. When we dove away, they followed easily. They fought like they carried unlimited fuel, making multiple passes, following us down to low altitude. We were conditioned to meta-fighters, watching fuel carefully, making one pass, then continuing home. These Mustangs played us like cats with mice. Johannes Steinhoff commanded JG-77. He would later write about the strategic shift. We had to assume every bomber formation held Mustang escort, even if invisible. Everything changed. The rules had changed completely. Large formation attacks were finished. We couldn't afford the time to get into position anymore. We had to move fast, strike hard with whatever fighters we had available, and absorb the losses that came with it. Our only hope was reaching the bomber streams before the Mustangs caught us. When those American fighters started appearing over Berlin, something else was happening at the same time. Something that had been quietly eating away at the Luftwaffe's strength for months. Fuel was running out. Germany had always relied on synthetic fuel production. The entire system depended on converting coal into aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process. But that process required massive industrial facilities, and massive industrial facilities made perfect targets for precision bombing. Before March 1944, these synthetic fuel plants had mostly been left alone. They sat beyond the range where bombers could operate accurately with fighter escort. The mathematics worked against any deep penetration mission. Without escort fighters, bombers couldn't survive long enough over the target to drop their bombs with accuracy. Without accuracy, the massive concrete structures of those hydrogenation plants could probably survive the attack intact. Then the Mustang changed everything overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent its first major strike against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers flew that day, protected by 735 fighters. Nearly 300 of those fighters were P-51 Mustangs. They dropped 1,700 tons of bombs with accuracy that shocked everyone. Production at Luna collapsed by 90% in a single day. By June, German aviation fuel production had plummeted from 175,000 tons per month to just 35,000 tons. By September, it was down to 7,000 tons. That wasn't enough fuel to keep 540 fighters operating across all fronts. Training flights vanished entirely. New pilots arriving at their units had less than 50 hours of flight time. Compare that to the 250 hours that had been standard back in 1942. A German pilot who had transferred from the fighting in the East described how quickly things had deteriorated. During the summer of 1944, we were allowed one training flight per week. Then it became one per month, then nothing at all. Replacement pilots showed up having never fired their guns in actual flight. They'd never practiced formation flying. They'd never engaged in any kind of mock combat. They were lambs going to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel anymore. It was experience. It was confidence. It was everything that separated a fighter pilot from a man in a cockpit. The true impact of the Mustang became impossible to ignore on June 6, 1944. D-Day arrived. The largest amphibious invasion in history required complete air superiority over those beaches. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe managed 319. They lost 35 aircraft doing it. Over the actual invasion beaches themselves, only 2 German fighters appeared the entire day. Just 2. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches. Flying with his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, he made one strafing run over Sword Beach before Spitfires chased him away. In his memoir after the war, Priller wrote about it simply: 2 planes. That's all we could manage against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage, we lacked fuel, we lacked aircraft. Above all, we lacked air superiority. The Mustangs had taken that from us months earlier, not over Normandy, but over Berlin. Major Werner Schroer had commanded fighters and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944. He reflected on what happened afterward. Once the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we never regained the initiative. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time, and they had fighters with them. We could barely defend our own airfields. The war in the air was lost the moment they could reach Berlin. Desperate times demanded desperate measures. The Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppe concept represented this desperation in its purest form. FW-190A8 fighters were modified with additional armor plating, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windscreens. These flying tanks would drive straight through fighter formations to attack bombers at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who took command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous commander of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led the Sturm fighters of JG-3 with support from two Gruppen of Bf-109s from JG-300. They launched a massive assault against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored FW-190s destroyed an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 490th Bomb Group in less than a minute. The cost was catastrophic beyond any strategic gain. 9 Sturm fighters were shot down, 3 more crash-landed. The escorting Bf-109s suffered even worse losses against the Mustang escort. These tactics worked briefly in July, but as American fighter strength grew, they became increasingly suicidal. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturm pilots to survive multiple missions, described what it was really like. "We were flying coffins. The armor that was supposed to protect us made us so slow that Mustangs could make multiple firing passes at their leisure. The order was to ram if our guns jammed, but how could we ram when we couldn't even get through the fighter screen to reach the bombers?" Each mission was Russian roulette, with all chambers loaded. Germany had one last hope: the Messerschmitt Me 262. Schwalbe, the Swallow, was the world's first operational jet fighter. It could fly at 540 miles per hour. That was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could have changed everything. But it arrived too late and in too few numbers. More importantly, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a fast bomber wasted precious months of development time. By the time significant numbers were available for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe couldn't spare the fuel to train pilots in their operation. Safe airfields didn't exist anymore. Adolf Galland, who had been removed from his position for criticizing Hitler's policies, was given command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945. Even with Germany's finest surviving pilots flying the world's most advanced fighter, they couldn't overcome the overwhelming numerical advantage of the Allies. Galland himself described the futility of it all. "We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, catching Me-262s during the vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. For every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and infrastructure becomes useless." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing what historians would later call the death of the expert. The veteran pilots who had scored dozens or even hundreds of victories were being killed faster than replacements could arrive. The presence of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was nowhere safe to train new pilots, nowhere quiet where novices could gain experience without getting killed. The statistics paint a brutal picture. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots got 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, that had been cut to 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours of experience in their particular aircraft. American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time. They had 100 hours in their specific aircraft. They'd had extensive gunnery training. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-260 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force. He reflected on what was happening. "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely maintain formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder. I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead within a week." The numbers confirmed this assessment. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units experienced complete turnover in a single month. JG-301, once an elite unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945. They claimed only 41 victories. Lieutenant Günther Hasse, who survived the war with 3 victories, described his first combat experience. My first mission was supposed to be a training flight, a patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots. We got bounced by Mustangs before we even formed up properly. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never even saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the tracers passing my canopy. I dove, leveled out, and flew home alone. That was my combat training. While the Luftwaffe bled in the skies, American bombing was methodically destroying German aircraft production. The Mustang's long range meant no factory was safe anymore. The major production centers at Regensburg, Augsburg, Vienna, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit repeatedly with devastating precision. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, testified after the war about what this meant. The Mustang allowed the Americans to maintain continuous pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production to caves and forests, but this increased costs and reduced efficiency by 75%. We were producing more fighters in 1944 than in 1943, but we couldn't produce them fast enough to replace losses. We had neither fuel to fly them nor pilots to fly them. The numbers made the tragedy clear. German fighter production peaked at 3,013 aircraft in September 1944. That same month, losses were 3,217. The Luftwaffe was literally losing aircraft faster than the world's most efficient industrial economy could build them. The quality of these hastily assembled aircraft was declining. Engines failed. Structural weaknesses appeared. System malfunctions plagued new aircraft. Engineer Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944. He was shocked by what he found. Aircraft were being delivered with critical defects. Engines that should run for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were jamming. Guns were misaligned. We had gone from producing the world's finest fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were exhausted. The materials were substandard. Testing was non-existent. We were sabotaging ourselves. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, virtually the entire remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn. Many were flying their first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The operation was so secret that German flak units weren't warned, resulting in devastating friendly fire incidents. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 190 were damaged. The cost was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft. More critically, they lost 213 pilots, including many irreplaceable experienced leaders. 3 Geschwader commodores, 6 Gruppencommanders, and 14 Staffel captains were killed or captured. Oberst Hans Kogler, who survived the mission, called it the Luftwaffe's death ride. We destroyed aircraft that the Americans replaced within a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. Worst of all, we burned our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were a spent force. We could no longer even pretend to contest the skies. The American response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps were methodically hunting down the weakened German fighter units. Airfields were strafed repeatedly. In the week following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly destroyed on the ground. Major John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who claimed 24 aerial victories, described what came after. It was almost sad. We'd find German airfields packed with aircraft that couldn't fly for lack of fuel. We'd strafe them, they'd burn, and there would be no opposition. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution. As 1945 progressed, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective force. Individual pilots still flew individual sorties, but coordinated operations became impossible. The appearance of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. Pilots began refusing to fly, not from cowardice, but from logical recognition. Taking off meant certain death with no possibility of affecting the war's outcome. The psychological toll was devastating. Hans Kogler, who had once written enthusiastically about defending the Reich, made his final published diary entry. "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers, all dead. For what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The Luftwaffe's own records, captured after the war, told the story in stark numbers. January 1944, 2,395 fighter pilots available for operations. June 1944, on D-Day, 1,523 fighter pilots available. January 1945, 742 fighter pilots available. April 1945, approximately 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war unwounded. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin had triggered a complete annihilation that consumed an entire generation of German aviators. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the impact of the P-51 Mustang. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, provides unique insight into the psychological collapse of a once dominant force. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and conflicts with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat. In a 1954 interview, he stated clearly, "The P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best fighter in every category. The Spitfire turned better, the FW-190 rolled better, the Me-262 was faster. But the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board." Johannes Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. His assessment was equally stark. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. We had built our entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Germany proper was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe from which we never recovered. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Hans Kogler, whose diary had chronicled the entire arc from confidence to collapse. In a 1975 reunion of former adversaries, he met Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. Kogler told him something that captured the moment everything changed. "You must understand, when we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us. Then suddenly, you were there, dominating our skies with fuel reserves that shattered everything we thought we knew. It fractured us completely, not merely our determination to keep fighting, but our confidence in every single thing we'd been taught to believe." Erich Hartmann, the war's deadliest pilot with 352 confirmed kills, managed to stay alive by inventing very specific tactics for battling Mustangs. His strategy was simple but brutal: attack only when holding every possible edge, then break away the moment Mustangs showed up. Looking back after the war, he was honest about what he'd learned. Fighting Mustangs wasn't real combat the way we knew it. It was about staying breathing. They possessed everything: more planes, higher altitude, greater range, and increasingly better trained pilots. We could only pray to make it through and perhaps catch a straggler separated from the group. The raw numbers showing the P-51 Mustang's effect on the European air war paint a picture of absolute American achievement and total German failure that's almost hard to comprehend. These fighters racked up 4,950 aerial victories across Europe. They destroyed another 4,131 enemy planes on the ground. This single aircraft type accounted for 48.9% of all American fighter claims in the European theater. The numbers tell an even starker story. Mustang combat loss rate came to just 1.2% per mission. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was losing 18% of its fighters per sortie. Overall, the Mustang killed at roughly 3.6 enemy fighters for every one it lost. Look at bomber protection, and the difference becomes almost impossible to ignore. Before the Mustang showed up, bombers were lost at 9.1% per mission. After the Mustang arrived, that dropped to 2.5% per mission. American bomber crew casualties fell by 68%. Consider how the Mustang revolutionized range entirely. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach out 375 miles from base. The P-38 Lightning stretched to 450 miles. The Mustang B and C models hit 650 miles with drop tanks. The later D model touched 750 miles with tanks. Those distances meant 100% of German territory was suddenly vulnerable. American factories churned out 15,686 Mustangs total. At peak output in 1944, they were rolling off the line at 320 per month. Each one cost about $51,040. German fighter production that same year produced 25,860 aircraft, yet never more than 1,500 stayed operational at any given moment. Look at pilot training and you see the real divergence. American pilots arriving in Europe by 1945 had logged 400 hours of flight time on average. German pilots entering combat between 1944 and 1945 averaged just 80 hours. The Luftwaffe pilot survival rate during those same years dropped below 15%. American fighter pilots completing their tour of duty succeeded at a 65% rate. When Mustangs appeared above Berlin, it represented far more than a battlefield victory. It was a fundamental revolution in how air warfare would be fought. For the first time ever, one nation could project overwhelming air power across the entire territory of another major power. The consequences extended well beyond this single conflict. General Carl Spaatz, commanding American strategic air forces in Europe, captured it perfectly in his report after the fighting ended. The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe. Not air superiority. That word implies a competition is still happening. We're talking about complete control. By spring 1944, we could attack any target we chose whenever we wanted and accept the losses involved. This wasn't merely military advantage, it became a psychological hammer. German people, soldiers and civilians alike, fell into despair when they grasped that we could strike anywhere, anytime. The Mustang triggered a cascade of strategic effects nobody could stop. No German factory remained safe. Production scattered to inefficient hidden locations far from the main cities. Supply lines faced constant attack. The already worn-out German economy simply collapsed. The fuel situation spiraled into catastrophe. Synthetic fuel plants that had previously been unreachable now faced systematic destruction. This created a vicious circle. Reduced fuel meant less pilot instruction, which meant worse combat performance, which meant even less fuel could be spared for training. Allied troops on the ground suddenly faced almost no enemy air opposition. The Luftwaffe simply disappeared from the skies. The breakout from Normandy, the lightning dash across France, the Rhine crossing all became possible because German forces could move only after darkness fell. Then came the collapse of belief itself. American fighters circling above Berlin destroyed the narrative Germans had been fed about their own invincibility. Civilians who'd been told America was weak and impossibly distant watched sleek silver fighters patrol the sky above their capital, completely unopposed. Germany had actually started the war holding technological advantages in multiple domains. The Bf-109 stood as arguably the world's finest fighter back in 1939. German aviators received world-class preparation, many having already tasted combat during the Spanish Civil War. German air tactics, especially the Finger Four formation and energy-based fighting methods, broke new ground. But the Mustang stood apart. It merged British innovation, the Merlin engine, with American manufacturing genius, built by North American aviation using methods copied from auto factories, then continuously refined based on what pilots reported from actual missions. It wasn't the creation of one designer having a brilliant flash. It came from constant collaborative improvement across an entire organization. The P-51D hitting squadrons in May 1944 packed numerous upgrades based directly on combat lessons. The bubble canopy gave pilots unobstructed views in every direction. 650 caliber machine guns with ammunition systems that fed more reliably, the K-14 calculating gun sight, reinforced wings capable of carrying more bombs and rockets, better radios for staying connected. The Packard 516-7 engine pumped out 1,590 horsepower. Every single change addressed something pilots had identified as a problem during fights. This cycle, pilots reporting problems, engineers solving them, better performance in combat. Repeat, created a machine the German system, fractured by Hitler's chaotic management and bombing damage, simply couldn't match. Dr. Kurt Tank, who designed the FW-190, admitted after the war what he couldn't say while fighting it. We possessed the knowledge to design fighters matching or surpassing the Mustang. The TA-152H outperformed it in certain areas. However, we couldn't manufacture them in meaningful quantities. We couldn't fuel them reliably. We couldn't train pilots to operate them effectively. The Americans didn't merely construct a superior fighter. They constructed a superior system for conceiving fighters, manufacturing fighters, and putting them to use. The Nazi response to the Mustang laid bare the rot inside their system. Rather than confronting the threat and adjusting, they rejected what they were seeing. Rather than focusing on fighters, Hitler kept demanding bombers. Rather than keeping experienced pilots alive as teachers, they flew them until they died. Rather than accepting strategic miscalculation, they executed pilots reporting what they saw. The impact among Germany's legendary aces proved particularly ruthless. These men had collected dozens, sometimes hundreds of victories across their careers. They weren't just pilots, but symbols of German military glory. The Mustang era witnessed their systematic elimination. Major Klaus Mitsch, credited with 72 victories, died fighting P-51's on September 17, 1944. He'd survived 452 combat missions only to be caught by Mustangs while preparing for an attack. Colonel Walter Osar, 123 victories on his record, fell to P-38's on May 11, 1944. Even older American fighters were becoming lethal as German flying quality deteriorated. Major Hans Phillips, with 206 victories in his logbook, was shot down by P-47's on October 8, 1943. Before the Mustangs arrived in force, yet his death foreshadowed what was coming. The names continued, a list of Germany's finest swept away one by one. By war's finish, of 107 German pilots achieving 100 or more victories, 95 had been killed, seriously injured, or captured. The Mustang hadn't just beaten the Luftwaffe, it had destroyed an entire generation of combat knowledge. As 1945 dawned, the Luftwaffe existed more as paperwork than reality. Fighters hid beneath trees, sat camouflaged on false landing fields, or scattered across stretches of highway. Pilots lived hunted existences, perpetually relocating to stay hidden from the ever-present Mustangs. Colonel Gordon Golob, among the last surviving senior leaders, handed down orders revealing their desperation. Aircraft will only leave the ground when bombers appear directly overhead. Flights limited to 15 minutes maximum. Any pilot remaining airborne beyond 20 minutes gets marked down as a deserter. The dread of Mustangs had grown so intense that numerous pilots would cancel missions the moment escort fighters entered the sector. Courts martial for cowardice multiplied, though killing off experienced aviators when so few remained made little strategic sense. Everything collapsed when pilots understood that winning a mission accomplished nothing. The bombers returned, the Mustangs stayed with them, and Germany continued dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, carrying 99 victories, got shot down and killed on December 23, 1944, a single victory away from reaching century ace status. His wingman watched 6 Mustangs strike from altitude and behind. Heinrich never had a fighting chance. They kept descending after him, guns blazing constantly. Even as his plane caught fire, they didn't stop. They wanted absolutely certain. This ruthlessness was different from before. Earlier in the conflict, something resembling honor had existed. Pilots who bailed out typically escaped attack. Damaged planes withdrawing were sometimes allowed to depart. But 1945 was different. American pilots had lost too many companions. They understood victory approached, and they intended ensuring the Luftwaffe never recovered. Every German pilot killed was one who couldn't pilot jets or experimental fighters Germany was attempting to perfect. American Mustang pilots offered consistent observations about how things shifted as months passed. Colonel John C. Meyer, with 24 aerial victories, gave his assessment straightforwardly. Between March and June 1944, we tangled with the Luftwaffe's elite, seasoned, aggressive, extraordinarily skilled. June through December put us against their second-tier forces, capable but less organized. By 1945, we were shooting down students, teenagers who barely managed formation flying, let alone genuine combat. The satisfaction faded, still necessary but profoundly tragic. Colonel John B. England, heading the 362nd Fighter Squadron, observed, "The Mustang provided something beyond just distance. It supplied psychological supremacy. German pilots recognized that spotting Mustangs probably meant they wouldn't survive. Their behavior showed this. Initially, they'd engage hard even when outnumbered. By late 1944, they'd turn and run at the first glimpse of us. By 1945, many wouldn't even launch if Mustangs had been reported nearby." Captain Chuck Yeager, destined to become the first person breaking the sound barrier, achieved 11.5 victories flying Mustangs. His view was typically straightforward. The P-51 was a straightforward airplane. It revealed its intentions plainly. It had no nasty surprises if you flew it correctly. Going up against German fighters in 1944 and 1945 felt like pointing rifles at swordsmen. We held all the advantages: velocity, distance, height, and quantity. It wasn't an even match, but war never should be. The most powerful testimonies came from bomber crews whose survival depended on fighter protection. Sergeant William McManus, gunner on B-17s with the 100th Bomb Group, recounted his experience. Prior to the Mustang, every mission seemed suicidal. We'd see our escort turn back toward England and realize the predators were coming. After March 1944, watching those Mustangs alongside us, clear to the target and returning home, they became our saving grace. Our casualty rates shifted from probably not surviving to probably making it home. The Mustang's triumph emerged not merely from brilliant design, but from manufacturing mastery. North American Aviation's facilities in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, achieved output levels that left Germans astounded. During peak 1944 production, North American finished one Mustang every 63 minutes. Assembly lines adapted from automobile construction split manufacturing into discrete specialized tasks. Laborers developed expertise in single jobs, achieving efficiency standards and accuracy that conventional aircraft techniques couldn't reach. Paul Peters supervised production at Inglewood and described the method. Our workforce included housewives running cable installations, teenagers fastening wing sections, men ineligible for military service assembling engines. Nobody had constructed aircraft before entering wartime production, yet our system was engineered so effectively that within weeks they generated flawless output. Quality reviews happened at every phase. If defects appeared, everything halted until corrected. German manufacturing showed a completely opposite picture. Bombardment forced their aircraft to be assembled in caverns, forests, and abandoned caverns. Individual components got manufactured hundreds of kilometers away from assembly zones. Maintaining acceptable quality became impossible. Frequently, workers were captured laborers harboring wishes to sabotage rather than help. Major Eberhard von Rastenburg, running different fighter squadrons throughout the struggle, described it this way: "Fresh aircraft arrived looking spotless, yet functioned as death traps. Fuel lines installed incorrectly. Hydraulic connections leaking. Weapons that malfunctioned. Americans manufactured superior aircraft in tremendous numbers, using workers desiring victory. We constructed fewer aircraft in caves, using prisoners, hoping we'd fall." The P-51's triumph over Berlin carried significance extending far beyond European circumstances. It demonstrated that air power could project across planetary distances, that geography no longer constrained American military reach. Japan, witnessing its protective borders shrink as American long-range fighters enabled attacks on the homeland, absorbed this lesson completely. Stalin and Soviet leadership paid close attention. Soviet pilots operating Lend-Lease P-51's appreciated their extended range and robustness. the Soviet Air Force commenced developing extended-reach escort fighters, recognizing that upcoming conflicts demanded the capacity to project force across immense territories. Soviet forces received and thoroughly evaluated 10 P-51's, though Soviet aviators never flew them against enemies. The Mustang served well past 1945's conclusion. In Korea, the designation changed to F-51 in 1948. These fighters performed close ground support duties. Israel deployed them during the 1956 Suez operation. Numerous air forces flew Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force didn't retire their last F-51D until 1984, spanning 40 years from its first flight above Berlin. Yet the Mustang's most significant inheritance was philosophical. It established that managing airspace means dominating not just combat zones, but complete nations. Modern air forces base doctrine around this principle, established when American fighters first showed themselves above Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind every number and strategic principle were individuals. Young people predominantly in their 20s, facing circumstances beyond normal experience. What Mustangs above Berlin signified shifted with perspective, yet everyone grasped something fundamental had changed. American pilots experienced vindication. Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote to his family, "We flew over the German capital today, absorbed that completely. We departed from English bases, crossed the entire length of Germany, circled above Berlin like we possessed it, because we did, and returned safely. Previously the Nazis bombed London. Currently, our fighters owned the skies above Berlin." Expressing the sensation challenges description, satisfaction, strength, and absolute conviction in our eventual triumph. German aviators confronted hopelessness. Oberst Rudy Miller from JG 302 penned words to his spouse. "I witnessed them today. American fighters above Berlin, single-engined fighters, practically impossible, yet undeniably there. Their capacity to reach Berlin suggests nowhere remains protected. My prospects of surviving seem increasingly remote. Everything believed turns out false. How do I communicate my expectations? How do I clarify that we comprehended nothing correctly?" German inhabitants faced the shattering of comfortable falsehoods. Berliner Ursula von Kaderow recorded her reflections. "We received assurances that Americans lacked vigor, that their pluralistic nation could never approach German capability. Today I observed American fighters passing overhead while our supposedly formidable Luftwaffe stayed absent." Everything represented deception. If they misled regarding this, what else was untrue? American bomber crews experienced deliverance. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, positioned in the B-17 Lucky Lady's belly, remembered. "Seeing those Mustangs taking position alongside us crossing into Berlin airspace, I shed tears without embarrassment. For the first time throughout my bombing campaign, survival appeared genuinely possible. Those little companions with their extraordinary reach preserved countless lives. When the fighting finally ended, the true scale of the Mustang's accomplishment became impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe, which had started this conflict as arguably the world's most formidable air force, had deteriorated into an ineffective shell of itself. The figures tell a sobering story. Between 1944 and 1945, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 45,000 aircraft. During that same period, roughly 15,000 German pilots were killed. Less than 5% of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational in January 1944 made it through the war uninjured. The bombing campaign destroyed 61 German cities, with over half experiencing devastating destruction. Between 350,000 and 500,000 German civilians perished from bombing. Industrial capacity fell by 35 to 40%. These numbers represent far more than military setback. They signify the collapse of an entire society. The Mustang had made possible a campaign that reached every German city, every manufacturing facility, every airfield. There existed no safe zones, no remote sanctuaries, nowhere to escape. A German military figure on trial at Nuremberg was asked a pivotal question. When did he realize Germany had lost? His response became one of the most remembered statements of the entire conflict. "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the contest was over." Everything that followed was merely prolonging the agony, sending more young men to die for nothing. Here stood a man not renowned for truthfulness, yet even he could not deny what the Mustang represented. American industrial strength combined with British technical expertise, delivered across vast ocean distances with devastating precision. The P-51's journey from original concept to Berlin escort fighter represents one of history's most rapid and effective aircraft programs. The NA-73X prototype took flight on October 26, 1940, merely 102 days after North American Aviation received the British Purchasing Commission's request. By March 1944, in less than 4 years, Mustangs were accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin. This rapid development path was complemented by constant refinement, drawing from actual combat lessons. Each successive model incorporated hard-won battlefield experience. The early P-51A with its Allison engine suffered from limited high-altitude capability. The P-51B and C models, equipped with Packard Merlin engines and the V-1653 power plant, transformed performance above 20,000 feet. The P-51D featured a bubble canopy, 6 guns, and upgraded systems powered by the V-1657 engine. The P-51H achieved peak performance through lighter construction, though it never saw European combat. This rapid improvement cycle, driven by frontline feedback, was something the German military, with its chaotic leadership and fractured production, could never replicate. While German engineers created technically brilliant designs like the TA-152H and ME-262, they lacked the ability to refine them through combat experience or manufacture them in significant quantities. The appearance of Mustangs above Berlin validated the entire American strategic bombing campaign. Before the war, theorists like Billy Mitchell and Julio Douay had proclaimed that bombing could win wars by demolishing industry and breaking civilian resolve. Yet until genuine long-range escort capability existed, this remained theoretical. The Mustang transformed theory into reality and made daylight precision bombing achievable. While the British continued their nocturnal area bombing campaign, Americans could now deliver bombs with exactness to specific targets. Ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft manufacturing complexes. The accuracy disparity was remarkable. British night bombing achieved an average circular error of 3 miles. American daylight bombing, supported by fighter escort, achieved just 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who would later command Strategic Air Command, observed, "The P-51 made strategic bombing function. Without it, we would have faced either catastrophic losses or resorted to ineffectual night bombing. With it, we could systematically obliterate specific industrial targets. We performed surgical destruction of their war-making capacity, not indiscriminate bombing." The outcomes proved decisive. German ball-bearing production plummeted 70%. Aviation fuel production collapsed by 95%. Synthetic rubber production dropped 85%. Railroad capacity declined 75%. Canal transport ceased entirely in Western Germany. This focused application of force, made feasible by Mustang escort presence, compressed the conflict by months or potentially years. Each destroyed factory, severed rail line, and torched fuel depot weakened German fighting strength progressively. The image of Mustangs above Berlin became one of World War II's most recognizable symbols, standing alongside the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet forces at the Reichstag. It embodied American military capability, technological mastery, and the inevitability of Allied triumph. For Americans, the Mustang symbolized national industrial and technical achievement. It graced war bond campaigns, Hollywood productions, and post-war victory celebrations. That a corporation with no prior fighter building experience could design and build it in record time encapsulated American ingenuity. For Germans, the Mustang signified humiliation and catastrophe. Post-war German literature and cinema frequently depict American fighters over German cities as emblems of the regime's inability to shield its citizens. The psychological scars from losing command of one's own skies haunted surviving Luftwaffe veterans forever. Hans Kogler, reflecting in 1953, observed, "For a fighter pilot, the supreme responsibility is defending your nation's skies. We failed. Those Mustangs over Berlin proved our failure to everyone who looked skyward. That humiliation never completely fades. Military institutions globally examine the Mustang's impact on European aerial combat as a benchmark for understanding technological transformation in warfare. The principles endure across decades. Range creates options. The capacity to exercise power across vast distances offers strategic alternatives adversaries cannot counter. The Mustang granted Allied commanders options the Germans simply could not match. Unified systems surpass isolated components. The Mustang triumphed through integration with bombers, fighters, intelligence, logistics, and training. Germany possessed excellent individual elements but lacked effective coordination. Numbers triumph over excellence. Manufacturing thousands of capable aircraft beats producing smaller quantities of superior designs. The Mustang was outstanding, yet crucially, vast numbers existed. Pilot preparation matters fundamentally. Technology absent skilled operators yields nothing. American training programs, emphasizing flight hours and authentic combat preparation, produced pilots who exploited the Mustang's potential completely. Flexibility ensures survival. Americans continuously refined tactics, systems, and preparation based on frontline experience. Germany, constrained by inflexible doctrine and political intrusion, could not shift strategy rapidly enough. Modern air forces incorporate these principles daily. Emphasis on extended-range strike power, coordinated air defense frameworks, pilot development, and industrial strength preservation all trace back to lessons drawn when Mustangs first dominated Berlin's skies. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, transcended tactical significance. It was the instant when Nazi Germany's foundational premises regarding the conflict imploded. The Reich was conceived as an unassailable fortress, insulated by distance, defended by the world's foremost pilots in the world's finest fighters. That single morning, Mustangs demolished these convictions. For German decision-makers, military and civilian alike, clarity came with devastating impact. They had predicated their entire strategic vision on America's incapacity to project force across the Atlantic with efficiency. They had dismissed American production as wasteful, American engineering as mediocre, American pilots as undisciplined. All assumptions proved catastrophically incorrect. Those Mustangs above Berlin represented incontrovertible evidence, impossible to rationalize, suppress, or disregard. Adolf Galland later recorded, March 6, 1944 marked the day we surrendered the war. Not during Berlin's fall, not at Hitler's demise, but when American fighters reached our capital. What transpired afterward was merely confirmation of inevitable defeat. The Mustang did not merely overcome the Luftwaffe. It demonstrated that American industrial democracy could manufacture, create, and wage more effectively than Nazi totalitarianism. Shock reverberated through German consciousness. If the regime could not secure Berlin against American fighters, what could it preserve? If every claim about American inadequacy had been fabricated, what other falsehoods pervaded the narrative? The Mustang functioned as an inadvertent messenger of reality. Its presence over German cities revealed that Nazi ideology rested upon deception. While Mustang victories proved decisive, the price proved steep. Between 2,500 and 3,000 P-51s met destruction in European combat. Each loss signified a young man who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone suffered more than 100 pilots killed in action. These represented America's finest youth. University students, competitive athletes, promising professionals who volunteered for combat flying. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding the 339th Fighter Group, died March 31, 1944, when anti-aircraft fire struck his P-51B near Brunswick. He was merely 28, married with 2 children he would never see mature. Across thousands of instances, young Americans paid existence's highest price for the strategic victory the Mustang had achieved. Captain Don Gentile, among the war's premier Mustang aces, boasting 21.83 confirmed aerial victories, survived combat operations only to perish in a flying accident January 1951 while testing a T-33 jet trainer. the war's legacy persisted long beyond armistice. Multiple Mustang pilots endured lasting trauma from their experiences, bearing invisible injuries that never fully mended. Yet their sacrifice accomplished something extraordinary. They transported warfare to enemy soil, compelled adversaries to defend their own territory, and achieved decisive victory. Following March 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe never reconstituted. Henceforth, it represented a fractured force, capable merely of sporadic, feeble resistance. When May 8, 1945 arrived, VE Day, as dawn broke across defeated Germany, American Mustangs maintained patrol over vacant skies. Resistance simply ceased existing. The Luftwaffe that once dominated European airspace, appearing invincible in 1940, had vanished completely. Its machines sat destroyed or immobilized from fuel shortages. Its pilots lay dead, wounded, or imprisoned. Its facilities existed only as rubble. The metamorphosis between March 6, 1944 and May 8, 1945, spanning merely 14 months, constitutes one of history's most thorough military triumphs. The P-51 Mustang functioned as the instrument enabling that victory, the mechanism transforming Allied air superiority from an expensive burden into an unstoppable advantage. Throughout those 14 months, Mustang crews completed more than 213,000 missions, credited with 950 aerial victories, and destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground. They released 31,000 tons of ordnance and discharged 99 million ammunition rounds. Underlying these statistics existed human experience. Young Americans, averaging 22 years old, piloting aluminum machines powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, methodically annihilated one of history's most formidable aerial forces. They accomplished this not primarily through individual acts of brilliance, though abundance of that occurred, but through superior technology, preparation, methodology, and production backing. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of warfare's most distinguished fighter commanders, perhaps best summarized the Luftwaffe's fate. They represented magnificent opponents confronted with overwhelming force. We possessed greater quantities of everything: aircraft, fuel, personnel, preparation, operational range. The Mustang extended our capacity to apply that superiority wherever we determined. Once Berlin became reachable, mathematical certainty of triumph became established. When Major Hans Kogler spotted those initial Mustangs above Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he perceived more than opposing aircraft. He witnessed what aerial combat would become. The P-51 had demonstrated that physics could overcome distance, that productive capacity could surpass individual brilliance, that systematic methodology could eclipse improvised creativity. The German pilots encountering Mustangs above Berlin were not confronting merely a superior machine. They were encountering the consolidated industrial, technological, and organizational capacity of the United States, channeled across an ocean and deep within their domain. It constituted a demonstration of capability that overturned fundamental assumptions regarding possibilities in air warfare. Hermann Göring's acknowledgement regarding losing the conflict when observing American fighters above Berlin ranks among history's most powerful admissions of defeat. But that moment's complete importance transcends one individual's comprehension or single nation's loss. Those Mustangs appearing above Berlin represented a watershed in how warfare itself operated. The instance when air power turned genuinely strategic, when manufacturing became more consequential than warrior traditions, when systematic organization eclipsed individual heroism. The German fighter pilots experiencing shock at Mustangs dominating Berlin had encountered something reverberating through subsequent generations. American power projected across immense distances with precision and overwhelming potency. Every contemporary military action from Korea through Kosovo, Vietnam through the Persian Gulf, has constructed itself upon foundations laid when those initial Mustangs penetrated Brandenburg airspace. Fundamentally, the P-51 Mustang accomplished more than protecting bombers or defeating German pilots. It eradicated remaining false beliefs, sustaining a regime established upon myths regarding racial destiny and national supremacy. It established that free societies, despite seeming disorder and ineffectiveness, could organize, invent, and project strength more successfully than authoritarian systems. It revealed that carefully applied technology and industry could conquer any protective advantage geography offered. The Luftwaffe aviators, gazing upward in astonishment at those silvery Mustangs March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. Within 14 months, their complete force would disappear, their nation subjugated, their ideology delegitimized. Witnessing impossible American fighters above Berlin signaled commencement of cascading realizations, concluding with Germany's utter devastation and reinvention. Modern P-51 Mustangs preserved at heritage facilities still perform at air shows, their distinctive Merlin engines creating acoustics immediately recognizable to those from that generation. For American veterans, it represents victorious sound. For German veterans, it reminds them of inception of termination. For scholars, it symbolizes the moment aerial warfare transformed fundamentally, when one power demonstrated capacity to project decisive air supremacy anywhere on the planet. The narrative of Luftwaffe aviators frightened by P-51 Mustangs above Berlin essentially concerns collision between expectation and fact, between falsification and truthfulness, between what seemed impossible and what American capability made standard. Those Mustangs didn't merely startle the Luftwaffe pilots witnessing them. They shattered an entire conceptual system into extinction. Yet emerging from that destruction came transformation. Multiple German aviators who survived that shock would participate in establishing post-war democratic Germany's Air Force, affiliated with the very nation whose aircraft had destroyed their companions. Johannes Steinhoff would eventually command the reconstituted German Air Force and subsequently lead NATO's military committee. During 1983, he positioned himself alongside American commanders who had piloted Mustangs against him, jointly safeguarding freedom his former adversaries had delivered to his conquered territory. Perhaps the greatest astonishment occurred in this transition, from sworn adversaries to committed partners. Those Mustangs soaring over Berlin hadn't merely inflicted damage, they ultimately delivered deliverance. German aviators, initially horrified by their 1944 appearance, eventually comprehended that those American fighters had emancipated them from a totalitarian regime, having brought them to ruin. Final recognition belongs to Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's commander of fighter forces, who had denied, subsequently experienced, then endured the Mustang assault. Throughout 1984, assembled in San Antonio with American and German fighter pilots, he raised his glass, honoring former foes. You astonished us when your Mustangs penetrated Berlin's skies. You astonished us via your production, your innovation, your resolve. However, greatest surprise arrived afterward when you reconstructed us, when you protected us against Soviet danger, when you became companions. Those Mustangs didn't merely terminate warfare, they established lasting peace. We survivors remain perpetually indebted. Completion had been achieved. The astonishment, starting with Hans Kogler's horrified identification of American aircraft above Brandenburg, had progressed through destruction and restoration into cooperation and reconciliation. The Mustangs had genuinely transformed the sky perpetually, not just March 6, 1944's Brandenburg atmosphere, but the strategic environment governing all societies subsequently. This progression comprises the P-51 Mustang's genuine inheritance, functioning not exclusively as victory's apparatus, but as transformation's catalyst, creating the post-war international framework that emerged. The 1944 shock experienced by Luftwaffe pilots could not have envisioned that American fighters destroying their organization would ultimately produce their homeland's renaissance and incorporation into liberal democratic fellowship. Yet transformation unfolded precisely this way. Those Mustangs appalling the Luftwaffe above Berlin transcended warfare conclusion. They established enduring peacefulness, persisting 8 decades onward. Perhaps ultimately, that constitutes their paramount accomplishment.